This is a lecture dealing with figure, ground, and positive-negative relationships. Here is a painting by Francois Morolet. His image looks a lot like some of the cut paper collages that you've been making when you're dealing with line for this first assignment that we've had. But take a look at the dynamic shapes that are just the white areas here. In particular, the shape on the right that is created by what looks like areas that have been overlaid on top of one another. So I think in any good composition, the positive space is just as important as the negative space, or the space that we think of as empty space is just as important. So this idea works with both representational as well as non-representational compositions. An example is if you are creating a landscape with a person walking through it. You literally have a figure-ground relationship there, but if you think about the shapes in the sky or the other areas in the scene, and how they are just as important as the figure or the narrative subject matter, that's really important. And that's the case here too, with these white shapes and the tensions and the detail that's created with these small white triangles, and that area is just as important to the eye as the black areas. Also, what I want to emphasize about this is because this is a black and white image on a white background, that there's a kind of implied border, and we know where the edge of this image is because of the way that the black cuts off, or it's cropped at the edge, which is what can be called an implied edge or an implied border. You'll realize this when we get into some of the black and white studies in this class. You might, for example, draw in the 6 by 9 inch space for assignments with pencil before you complete your image, and then erase it when you're done. Here's a graphic design by Helen Yentis, which is taking these formal elements of shape and positive-negative space and diagonals and repetition and creating a look of spiraling downward and falling in a simple but kind of formal way. This just shows you how simply these ideas can be applied. Also, I want to emphasize the tensions that are created here with positive and negative tensions. But the tension doesn't work if you cover up that white triangle right here at the top, because you might have too much tension at the bottom if that didn't exist. So this just shows you asymmetrically how the white at the top can really balance off all of the tension with the many touching edges at the top and the bottom of this composition. Here's a composition by Bill Bragg that is representational and shows a man being trapped in a courtyard. It's a nice use of formal elements here that we've just been talking about, such as diagonals, positive-negative space, and the use of those things to add a sense of drama that this man is being trapped inside of this space. This is a Francis Lee Jacques pen and ink drawing. What I want to emphasize here is, again, that implied black and white border because of the way the white bleeds into the white. If we invert it, the image still holds up and emphasizes how these positive-negative relationships and figure-ground relationships are important. So when we're talking about figure-ground here, we might say that the figure is the trees, the guy on the rocks, and the sky and ground elements kind of turn into negative space. He's creating a tension between negative and positive space here, where the white areas that are void of detail have been turned into negative space that is just as important as the positive space. Another thing I want to point out is that it's a really interesting example of cropping. We can refer again to how an artist chooses what to include or what to exclude from a composition. Here I can identify 3 major areas where the image is cropped, which works well because it's an uneven number that's not too balanced and it's not too symmetrical, it's asymmetrical. These cropping areas could be referred to entry or exit spaces into or out of the composition. And you can imagine this is how you're helping someone lead their eye around your image. So for me, I enter in the top left, then trickle down to the right and around the detail on the stones and exit at the bottom right. And what brings me back is the tree line in the background on the right and the lighter tree, which brings me back in and creates another zigzag throughout the picture. So it's important to think about designing compositions within a space, to think about how you crop things to create figure-ground relationships, positive-negative space, and movement throughout your compositions. Here's an ink drawing made on a panel by Vasco Maro. Although the white space here is just flat space on a panel, it takes on dimension, and he's activating this space by the way that he creates the shapes with the architecture within the activated or the positive space. By doing this, it is complicating the figure-ground relationship and positive-negative relationship because we're not sure which is the figure and which is the ground because of the way he's created these white shapes with the architecture here that are activated. In this image, the portrait at the bottom has a lot of implication for the outline of the figure's hat, his hair, and his shoulder line, none of which have been drawn in here. His likeness is there, and then the edges that are cutting into the scene with the other figures and the forest scene are what defines his outline and places him into that space, even though there's really nothing there that is drawn. So again, the positive-negative space is somewhat complicated here. I do want to talk about how when you begin to push these elements of design deeply and innovate with them, how they begin to have conceptual meaning that is beyond just how you use them to make strong compositions. So here this painter, Njika Akunyili Crosby, is embedding a lot of what we think of as negative space or shadow or areas that are not the main subject with collage and information about history and about racial and gender identity. So it's interesting that she's taking the space that we sometimes think of as unimportant and using it to convey information that's very important to the figure in the ground. And you can see that starting to use these elements of design more conceptually can be very dynamic and interesting.